I would like to invite Jessie Renauta, our manager, professional development training program. Jessie.
Thanks, Johanna. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessie Renauta, Manager of Professional Development and Training at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, OCASI. Also, if you can't hear me, just give me a... on behalf of the Council, welcome, and thank you for joining us for navigating legal status and belonging, supporting youth with no or precarious immigration status. This conversation is both timely and necessary. Across Ontario, young people living with precarious or no immigration status encounter significant structural barriers in education, healthcare, housing, income security, and employment. These barriers are not isolated. They are shaped by immigration policy, systemic inequities, and the intersection of race and status. They're also built upon and reinforced by colonial legacies. And so we must acknowledge the land on which OCASI is situated and does its work. It's the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. We recognize the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. At OCASI, we are committed to incorporating the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the calls to justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report into our policy and advocacy work. We express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. We also commit to deepening our understanding of Indigenous history and building relationships of solidarity through our capacity development initiatives. OCASI respects the right to self-determination and land back for Indigenous peoples globally and acknowledges our responsibility to stand in solidarity with them. I invite everyone here today to reflect not only on the land that you are on currently, but what circumstances and forces may have brought you here. For myself, I was born and raised on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, which includes the Tsawwassen, Stalo, Kwantlen, Semanis, and Musqueam, also called Vancouver. I'm born to parents who immigrated from Punjab, a region with long-standing links to Canada through British colonialism. Many Punjabis were displaced from their land because of British colonial policies and first arrived on the territories of the Coast Salish people as labor, predominantly in the emerging forestry industry to further the settler colonial project of Canada. These early and mainly Punjabi Sikh arrivants referred to the Coast Salish people as Taeke, the Punjabi word meaning our elder cousins, expressing a kinship and respect for whose home they had arrived in. I hold this legacy close, and I hope to restore that sense of kinship and respect in the work that I do, including here at OCASI. Again, I invite you all to reflect on your own arrival to this land. Today's forum is designed to strengthen sector capacity through informed, ethical, and anti-racist dialogue and practice. It is also about system alignment. Together, we will explore immigration categories and the current legal landscape, the intersection of race and immigration status, referral pathways and cross-sector advocacy, legal and ethical considerations in service delivery, the lived realities of youth who are directly affected. This work strengthens both frontline practice and our collective understanding of where policy and systems must evolve. It also connects to the broader need for regularization. OCASI has consistently supported permanent and inclusive pathways to status for undocumented people. With Bill C-12 set to pass, although yesterday's news of a Senate committee's recommendations to remove parts of the bill relating to immigration has been somewhat encouraging, changes to migrant worker programs may increase precarity, underscoring the need for renewed national attention to regularization. OCASI is the umbrella organization and collective voice of Ontario's immigrant and refugee serving sector, representing over 250 member agencies. OCASI works to advance equity and build sector capacity through professional development and training, practical tools and resources, peer communication and collaboration across the sector. OCASI also provides trusted information directly to communities and service providers through settlement.org and, forgive my French, établissement.org. Through the Settlement, Employment and Youth, or SAY initiative, funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, OCASI supports accessible, high-quality learning opportunities that respond to emerging sector needs. And today's forum reflects that mandate, bringing together legal, settlement, and youth-serving sectors to deepen shared understanding and strengthen coordinated responses. We are grateful for the leadership of Childhood Arrivals Support and Advocacy Centre of Canada, CASA, whose work focuses on young people brought to Canada as children who are now living with precarious or no immigration status. CASA's model bridges direct legal support with systemic advocacy, working to shift policies and public attitudes that exclude youth who have made Ontario their home. Through the Borderless Access to Education, or BATE, collaboration alongside Justice for Children and Youth, the Sanctuary Student Solidarity and Support Collective, and Black Creek Youth Initiative, partners are advancing structural change to ensure equitable access to education. This partnership approach reflects what we know to be true. Sustainable change requires coordinated advocacy across sectors. Today is an opportunity to strengthen our collective response, not only to better support individual young people, but to examine our policies, institutions, and service systems. To examine how our policies, institutions, and service systems can evolve. Thank you for your leadership and your commitment to ensuring that belonging is not conditional on immigration status. I look forward to a thoughtful and action-oriented day together. Thank you.
I would like to announce the session 1 objectives. This session provides foundational context, legal realities, policy gaps, and systemic barriers affecting youth with no or precarious status, and explores how a practitioner can respond ethically and effectively. I would like to invite Sarah Paul, Executive Director, and Esther Lekshin, Staff Lawyer, Childhood Arrival Support and Advocacy Centre of Canada. Please join me welcoming Sarah and Esther.
Hi everyone, thank you. My name's Sarah Pole. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the ED at the CASA Centre. It's really nice to be here. There's a few of us in the room, so I'm going to introduce all of the folks from all the different organisations who are speaking today. And that's really because we are feeling really grateful to be able to gather with you today, and we want to make the most use of your time and our time, and to give you the chance to meet as many of us as possible and to have conversations sort of around the edges of our sessions. So maybe what I'll do now is firstly introduce Esther, who is the CASA lawyer.
Hi, everybody. My name is Esther. I also use she, her pronouns. And as Sarah said, I work as a lawyer with CASA, providing legal advice and other legal supports to our clients.
And now the folk at CASA are going to hate this, but I'm going to ask you to stand when I say your name, please. I can see Danique in the back of the room. Danique's been with CASA for a really long time. It's lovely to have you here, Danique. And I say that because next to Danique is Olivia, who started last week. Olivia takes care of our education and outreach. And as it happens, Olivia is actually an old hand with CASA because Letitia started yesterday. So thank you all for being here. Also with CASA, we have our friend David. Hi, David, who's a consultant who's been helping us out. And moving on from CASA, we have our good friend Emily Chan, who is from Justice for Children and Youth. Hi, Emily. And then moving on to your afternoon session, from the debate session, there are two speakers. Destin, where are you? Destin is here. Destin is the Executive Director of the Black Creek Youth Initiative. And I don't yet think I see Brantella, but Brantella Williams is also going to join us, and she is the Executive Director of the S4 Collective. And I've said that because I'd love for you to come and talk to us during the day. We've sort of put ourselves at different tables totally so you can talk to us. So don't leave us alone. We would like that very much. And I wanted to start by thanking OCASI for having us, the CASA program, but also for bringing us together in this way. We spend all of our time at CASA thinking about young people with no or precarious status, and we know that our interests can be a bit niche. We think about young people and we think about people without status. So it's really nice to be in a room full of people who are working with migrants and newcomers, but probably in different contexts than the way we are. So we're also really excited about learning from you today. We know that there's a ton of expertise in the room. And when I looked at the registration list, there are people who do all sorts of interesting things that we want to learn about. What we hope is that we're pitching things at a level that's of value to you, but please feel free to ask us questions or to push us along if you've heard it all before. We apologise if that's the case. We also know that in this room in downtown Toronto, there's probably a ton of folk here who have migration experiences of their own. And I want to recognise that brings, a lot of heart and experience to the work you do. And it certainly brings it to us at the CASA program. But we also recognise that immigration pathways and migration journeys can be really different for different people. So I know that for me, trying to hold the fact that my own experience is usually really different from the clients we serve. In terms of what we're trying to do today, we are hoping to blend law and legal pieces with practical realities, because what's the law if you can't actually enact the law or make it happen for you? So that's sort of what we're hoping we're doing today, and sort of hoping to sort of blend here's the law, but here's actually some tips and strategies for how actually to make it happen for young people. As Jesse said in his introductions, we really are in really heightened times for migration in the world and in Canada. All the changes we're seeing from the federal government in terms of processing times or pathways or cuts to eligibility are having a massive impact on our client base. And I know also your client bases as well. And I know there's been even more cuts even today about funding to the settlement sectors across the country. So it's just this sort of ever expanding sort of perfect storm that's coming down on our ability to help young people and migrants in general. So I want to acknowledge that it's hard. We're certainly seeing it in our work in terms of the number of young people who are looking for services, and we're seeing it when we're in classrooms and schools and hearing the comments that other young people feel emboldened to make. So it's important that we're coming together to have these conversations now. And we'll talk a little bit more about our clients, but I just want to say I feel like the clients that CASA serves really live in a interesting liminal space. And by that I mean a real in-between space. So I think a lot of our clients would not be eligible for any IRCC-funded settlement services. They float outside that. But they also sort of float outside school systems or financial support systems, and they do an absolutely amazing job of carving out safety and security for themselves in these really challenging circumstances. So I'm really glad that one of the sessions we're doing today, our last session, is a youth panel where young people are going to talk about their lived experience. So I want to express my gratitude now for those young people who've said yes to us. That session, we're not going to have any questions. If there is something that you want to ask, perhaps you can put it on a piece of paper and we'll see if we can make that happen. And we're going to particularly ask for that session that there's no photos or anything of that nature. But I'm really glad that we get to close the day with young people, explaining the realities and explaining how they manage really complex issues. But other than that, I think we can get cracking. Okay, yes. In terms of trying to make today as practical as possible, I think all of the sessions, we've got a few scenarios sort of built in, but we also wanted to give you an activity to work on during the day. So you'll see at your table there is an activity. This one, it's just got some scenarios on it. And those scenarios have been created from fairly typical client experiences that we've had. And our goal is, if you wish, and there's certainly no requirement, if you find it helpful to think about those scenarios as we go through the day and make notes, so a sort of a practical application of the things that we're talking about as we go. We're really happy to talk about them during the day, and I think anybody that I introduce would be happy to talk to you about them as we go. And it may be that there's not really great concrete answers to them, because that's the world we live in and the realities of the sort of services that we provide. But I like to doodle, so I like having an activity on the go. So maybe there's some people in the room who will find that helpful as well.
And just to add, if you're participating online, you should have gotten a PDF of these scenarios by email yesterday. So you can check your email if you didn't see it yet.
And that is a good reminder. I talk fast, so if there's anyone who would like me to slow down, please let me know. I have been told that many times. So, but I'm happy to slow down if you tell me to. I will try, particularly for the folks online. So the goals of the CASA presentation, as Tarana said, is, I would break them down into a simpler three. Firstly, provide folks working with young people the tools to spot legal issues and to make good referrals, which sounds fairly simple. The second one, to bring together allies to advocate for better policy and practice and to better access to justice for this group or this population. And then the third, which I think is generally CASA's first sort of goal of most things we do, is to build and strengthen a national conversation about young people and how they are held in our immigration system and how our immigration system does or does not serve them, and how there are tons of young people living in Canada with immigration precarity. So that national conversation, that's what we're doing right now. We're part of that in this session and throughout the day. Our organisation has a really long name. We go by CASA because it's so much easier. This year is actually, we're celebrating our 10 years of existence. We've been in a few different iterations over those 10 years. But for the last 5 years, we were actually a program of Justice for Children and Youth Legal Clinic, our friends from JFCY. And last year, due to service needs and demands, we actually became a separate organisation. So now we're close partners of JFCY, but we're a separate organisation. We serve people across Ontario. We're based in downtown Toronto, so lots of our services will happen remotely. And we serve young people up to the age of 25 who were brought here as children. And that's an important distinction. We serve young people. So young people themselves are our clients. We generally don't serve families. So most of our clients are, for whatever reason, needing to understand their immigration situation and their options completely independently of family. There's one exception where we do often work for families, and that's around school access. And that's because some of those clients are really little who are being excluded from school. So in those situations, we would work for adults or for parents or caregivers. And the main sort of areas of our work are making sure that young people get really good information and summary legal advice, which means here's your legal situation, here's what your options are, and if you want to take steps now, you know what to do. The second piece we do is connection to ongoing legal representation. So if a young person needs to submit an application or make a claim, that they are connected with a lawyer that we think is going to do a really good job of working with that particular young person. So sometimes that's in our clinic. Sometimes that's Esther saying, for whatever reason, we need to take that file on ourselves. We're tiny, so we triage the work that we keep in our centre to the most complex cases, particularly for really young people or people who have some kind of intersecting or compounding issues. But often we're connecting young people with lawyers from the private bar on legal aid certificates or other clinics, or in some cases, if people aren't eligible for legal aid certificates and can't afford a lawyer, because who can, then pro bono retainers if we can. And then once we've made the connection to a lawyer for ongoing representation, we usually stay involved as navigators so that hopefully that young person has a 2-person professional team who are helping them navigate often years and years and years of an immigration application or a claim. And that's because we recognise that the differential between lawyers and young people can often be really big. So making sure that that connection works, and also recognising that for lawyers, it can be really helpful having another adult who is helping the young person, supporting that young person gather evidence, do all the kind of wrangling, do all the pieces that mean that the lawyer can focus on legal work. The other piece that we do is trying to make sure our clients access all the services around the immigration system. So here we're talking education, healthcare, financial services, housing, those sorts of pieces, really to make sure that they are ready and safe and able and in a position where they can focus on their legal pieces. And then we do a ton of training and outreach. So a lot of that is directly for young people, so that they know that maybe they're not alone and that they may not be the only person without status, for example, in Toronto or at their school even, and that they know that they're entitled to get information and help, and that they know that there's some people who might be able to provide them services in a way that feels supportive and safe for them. So a lot of those are in schools. I think last year we did in excess of 250 workshops in schools across Ontario. We think of them as stealth workshops in that they are designed to be curriculum linked and relevant to every student in a classroom. But if there is a young person in that classroom who has some kind of immigration precarity, that there's messaging in there that they can hold and they can learn without having to put their hand up and say, in front of their classmates or their teacher, that's me and I've got questions. So I think of them as stealth. How do we get this information to young people, but also to the adults in the classrooms, such as their teachers? We also do a ton of trainings for people who work with young people, such as yourselves. So sometimes that's educators, sometimes that's youth workers or shelter workers, sometimes it's lawyers. And then we try as much as we can, being a tiny organisation, to impact positive change. How do we make our immigration system better understand young people's needs and vulnerabilities? How do we make it do better? How do we make our education system do better? So, and obviously as a tiny organisation, we need to partner with people and amplify each other's voices on that. But that's sort of us in a nutshell. I would say, most of our clients, I'll talk a little bit more about our clients. Maybe I'll hand over to Esther to talk about this piece first.
Hi. So this slide is designed to give you a bit of an idea of who CASA serves, and also to understand, what are people's immigration different immigration situations people are in. So immigration precarity for CASA means people who are not citizens or permanent residents. Anyone living in Canada without permanent status. And as you can see from the slide, this can include people who have valid temporary status, so could be as a visitor, as a student, people who are awaiting outcomes of a refugee claim, which would give them a type of temporary status, or other immigration applications, which may or may not. Some people who have made an immigration application have a type of temporary status and others don't. People whose applications have been denied, whether that's a refugee claim, another immigration application, a sponsorship, something like that. And then people who are living, and the people who are living without status, which includes some of the categories that I've already talked about. So people who have no valid or legal immigration status, but are living in Canada. And so what can lead to a young person's precarious immigration status? I think in some ways it's easy for us to understand for adults, like somebody who chooses to come here and ends up possibly without status. But in our client situations, it's often because of choices that other people have made for them. So we see a lot of similarities, and every client has their own individual experience and their own individual situation. But it's very typical for our clients to have a valid temporary status when they enter Canada. So, for example, they enter as a visitor or as a student, and then their temporary status expires, and they're still here. We also see a lot of children and young people who were brought as dependents of their parents or caregivers. Possibly the adult had a work permit or a study permit to stay, and the children are dependents on that. And then sometimes, unfortunately, because of situations like family breakdown or family conflict, the parent isn't renewing the young person or the child's status. And so then that child or young person is left to try and figure out the situation on their own. And there are other examples. We're happy to share, again, as Sarah said, please feel free to come and speak to anybody who works with us, and we can help you understand, if you want, how our clients end up in these situations, and more about that.
As Esther said, each client has their own particular experience, as I think all of us do here, in the sense of how we came to Canada or how our people came to Canada. But we do see a few groups that are fairly common repeats of situations for us. So we regularly see young people who arrived as really tiny people. So maybe they came in as 3 or 4 year olds, they were with family, and they've essentially lived their whole life in Canada. They have no recollection of home country or their country of citizenship. They may have no ties in that country, and they understand themselves as completely Canadian. And often everybody around them also understands them as completely Canadian because they've been at school this whole time, and they fit in really well. And often we find that group is doing a really good job and working really hard to make sure that no one ever finds out about their lack of status. So they're not telling friends, they're not telling teachers, they're not telling guidance counsellors. So from the sense of, for example, a school, thinking about who in this school might need settlement services or who in this school might need help around status, this group is doing a really good job of sidestepping that help and specifically not approaching people who may be well placed to help. So that's a common one for us. Another common group is maybe young people who arrived at any age and perhaps were included on unsuccessful immigration applications. So they have more of an immigration history, but they're probably unaware of it. And that's because adults were doing the applications, because that's what adults do. Fantastic. But that does mean that when they come to later in their sort of teenage lives, they're like, what on earth is my immigration history, or what happened, or what does immigration already think I'm doing, or what have they already been told about me? Another group we see a little bit is young people who are in Canada with no people at all, and somehow came to Canada or were brought to Canada and are completely unaccompanied. Sometimes they're with perhaps non-family members who feel some kind of responsibility, but not a legal responsibility or not a great deal of responsibility. And sometimes they are completely alone in Canada. So that kind of unaccompanied or unseparated or separated young people. And then another group we've been seeing over the last couple of years is young people who have understood as having status. Perhaps they're permanent residents, and perhaps they're coming to see us because it's become obvious to them as they've got older that the way that they got their status included misrepresentations or untruthful statements to immigration that is now putting perhaps them at risk in terms of that status being removed. So again, having to deal with the consequences of other people's actions. And I think that's really the big thing for us. All of our clients came as children. Sorry. Do you want me to slow down, Tarana? Let me apologise to the ASL interpreter. I do talk fast. I'm going to try to talk slower. So in terms of our clients, I think a couple of really common things for all of them. Usually they've had no agency in the decision to come, and they're trying to play catch up in the sense of what happened to me, what does immigration already know? And sometimes that can be a really challenging exercise in itself, in that getting information from family or caregivers sometimes comes really easily, and sometimes that's a really fractious conversation for our clients. So being able to obtain information in a safe way that maybe doesn't put risk on their relationships or their ability to stay at home can be really, really challenging. Another commonality is that all of our clients need good legal advice. They need to understand what their options are. They need to know the consequences of taking action or not taking action, and what the chance or what the likelihood is as they make different applications. And I think the other commonality is the legal system and the immigration system is brutal. It's brutal and it's long. So having a team of sort of navigators or supporters to help them through is often the thing that makes it successful for them. So those are the three commonalities, regardless of how different their experience is getting here. And just to give you an idea of sort of how we work, our first position is that children have rights. They're individual rights holders. And by that I mean it's not, their rights aren't because of their parents. Their rights are theirs as individuals. And they're not simply appendages to other people's immigration applications. And our immigration system does a really good job of trying to understand everybody as fitting into particular sort of heteronormative sort of family structures. That there's going to be parents, there's going to be kids, and it's all going to be working out well. And I think for a lot of people it does, and that's fantastic. That's not what we see. So I don't think our immigration system is as good at dealing with people who float outside that structure. Particularly young people, maybe under the age of 18, who need to figure this stuff out for themselves. But that's our position. Our immigration system has to understand and treat children and young people as individual rights holders. And it's important to state that sometimes young people, sometimes their views or their interests or their wishes may differ from the adults in their life. And that makes things really complicated for young people. But their views should be heard, and their decisions that they're making about their life, they should have a piece in that conversation and those decisions. Some of our clients are living in family circumstances where family are supportive, even sometimes when maybe family don't have status themselves, but they're supporting a young person to apply for status, regardless of the consequences for the adult. But more likely, it's young people needing to make an application without any connection to parents. And I think that's a challenging thing for our clients. I think of them as being often on a really big emotional journey. A really typical client for us might be someone who is 16 or 17 in school. They're thinking about post-secondary, and their guidance counsellor is like, what are you doing after school? Have you got the right credits to go to university? This is the kind of status you need. And it's at that moment that it dawns on them that, oh, goodness me, I don't have those documents you're asking for. And that's the very moment where they realise that their lack of status or their questions about maybe not having status actually come to roost, and they realise that they're on a very different course from anybody else in their classroom. And that can be a heartbreaking, pulling the rug out from someone's feet moment. And then the decision for a young person to understand what a lawyer is, understand how to come and get advice, and understand how to take agency over their situation, again, can take a really long time and can be a really big emotional toll. And I think the other piece to that is our clients are often put in a big loyalty bind. Should I apply to regularise my status because I want a future for myself? Or is that going to put my mum at risk or somebody else at risk? And how do I balance that decision? And I think that's a decision in a loyalty bind that's hard for everybody at any age. I think it's particularly hard for young people. I think all of you can remember being at high school and all the changes that were going on then. And if you add this immigration precarity on it, it can cause really extreme stress for young people in those settings. And it also means that they have to find strategies for dealing with all those caring adults in the school who are asking all those helpful questions about what university are you going to, and not wanting to explain why. So having to come up with really helpful strategies or clever strategies for avoiding conversations, not revealing themselves, but still fitting into a classroom. It's an impressive juggling act that many of our clients do.
So I think many of you will be familiar with some of the details on this slide. Immigration processes in Canada can take a long time, sometimes a very long time. They can be very complex. They often don't have firm timelines for when they'll be resolved. So one thing I would caution about as a lawyer is against creating expectations, especially with young people, about how long their immigration application may take to be resolved. I think that that's a very it's often not helpful to create those kinds of expectations, even if they're based on accurate past experience. The situation is always changing. Individual applications can take different amounts of time. And so I think it can be very difficult for young people when they've had a certain expectation sort of created, and then they bump up against maybe a different reality. The other thing that we wanted to highlight on this slide, and this has to do, again, with processes changing, long timelines, complexities, is that there are two changes, recent and sort of ongoing. We already heard mention about Bill C-12, which is making its way through the Senate right now, which will have very serious implications for people making refugee claims in Canada, among other things. I won't get into all the sort of legal details, but it's important to understand that it will make it much more difficult for many people, and especially many of the people that CASA sees who haven't necessarily come to Canada recently. It will make it much more difficult for them to make a refugee claim. And it will apply to certain claims retroactively. So it's not only going to affect people who make a refugee claim after the bill passes, if it does. So you'll probably be tired of hearing this from me and from us by the end of the day, but it's really important that people get legal advice if they are thinking of making a refugee claim, or if it's something that might be in their future. And the other thing that we've seen recently, which is not a law change, but the processing times for humanitarian and compassionate applications, which are very often the only application available to CASA's clients. If somebody goes to make a new humanitarian application today, they will see that their processing time is more than 10 years with no further information. So there isn't even actually an accurate prediction of how long these applications are going to take to be processed. And we also don't know exactly what that means and how it will apply to different applicants. So these are two really big changes that are affecting our clients, and that Sarah and I spend a lot of time talking to young people about and trying to explain. And I think it just really underscores why it's so important that people get high quality legal advice, even before they, in some cases, decide what type of application is the best route forward for them. So here I've put a few acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms in immigration law and in the work that we do. And I want to apologize in advance. I know if anybody has looked at the scenarios, I do try and be mindful of explaining acronyms. I didn't necessarily do that in every case on the scenarios. So I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. But I wanted to go over some things that we commonly see some confusion about, or just to sort of clarify some of these terms and definitions. So the first one is the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which is the law. That's the immigration law, along with the regulations that governs the immigration system in Canada. The second point, so the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada and the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada Department are often confused, and I've encountered many clients who think they're interchangeable, and they're not, although there is a lot of information sharing. And Canada Border Services Agency is a different government department, also a lot of information sharing. And I mention that because it can be important to understand that there's both information sharing and also sometimes misunderstandings about what's going to be shared. So there is a lot of information shared between these three organizations, I'll say. But in other cases, there isn't. So if somebody is told, for example, to update their address with one of these, with either the refugee board or with one of the government departments, it's not necessarily reliable that that is going to be shared back and forth. It's important for people to understand what information is being shared or might be shared, but also what information isn't necessarily going to be shared. Undocumented or no status. So these are terms that we use a lot, and they may be you may be very familiar with them, or you may not. As I said before, they really just mean somebody who has no valid temporary or permanent status in Canada, no legal immigration status. And we would encourage everyone here and also to share with your colleagues or people you meet to use these terms instead of things like illegal, or sometimes if you read a lot of American news, you might see the term alien, illegal alien. We really prefer things that talk about terms that describe people's documentation as opposed to describing them as a person. Visa versus permit. We unfortunately see a lot of confusion between these terms. And I apologize if this is a bit dry, but hopefully it's useful to some of you. A visa is, it's like a sticker. You'll see it in people's passport. And it gives people the right to travel to Canada. It doesn't give them an absolute right to enter the country necessarily. It's basically what lets them get on the plane if they have the valid visa in their passport. It doesn't give them an absolute right to enter Canada. And very importantly, it doesn't give them any status here once they've arrived. The visa in their passport, the sticker in their passport, is not what gives them status once they arrive. And we see a lot of confusion about this, of people who come who have a visitor visa that may be valid for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they think that's their status in Canada. And it's not accurate. Visitor status is generally, although not always, 6 months from the date of entry. So if somebody enters as a visitor, they generally have visitor status for 6 months, whether or not immigration stamps their passport when they enter. And a study permit or a work permit will be a full-size piece of paper, like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And that's the document. If someone is here as a student or a worker, that's the document that gives them their status. It's not the visa in their passport that let them enter. And the last one is some terms around refugees and refugee claimants. So a refugee claimant is someone who has made a refugee claim in Canada and is awaiting a decision or awaiting the outcome of an appeal. You may hear the term asylum seeker. Asylum is not a legal term in Canada. It's not you won't find the word asylum in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It mostly comes from American sort of news commentary. A refugee is a more generic term for somebody who has refugee status, which could be that they were granted refugee status in Canada. It could be that they were granted refugee status overseas by the UNHCR or in another country. And protected person is a legal term in Canadian immigration law, which is a person who's been found to be a refugee either by a Canadian visa officer overseas, a person who has won a claim at the Immigration and Refugee Board, or a person who got a positive decision on a pre-removal risk assessment in most cases. And I've put a link at the bottom. IRCC has a glossary. So if you're working with young people and you're trying to accurately sort of communicate with them and use accurate terminology, I would encourage you to also check the glossary, which can be, it's very comprehensive and can be very helpful.
And we find often young people will come and do intakes with us and they'll tell us what their status is, and it's not. So really trying to understand or find confirmation of really what the immigration department thinks someone's status is, because young people or your clients might be using words in a different way than you are or than what immigration is using. The next slide is on impacts of immigration precarity, and these are huge. I think that some people feel like immigration status is a fairly siloed thing. This is the bit about your immigration status and the rest of your life goes on. But that's not what our clients experience. We find that many of our clients, their immigration status pretty much impacts every aspect and every decision, every aspect of their life and every decision that they make in a day. So, and that's often complex and interlapping or sort of overlapping and intersecting. So that means that young people often have to sort of navigate a real web of understanding what their eligibilities are, what they're excluded from, and how they can navigate in a way that doesn't create further risk or further problems from them from an immigration point of view. And obviously our immigration system's federal, then we've got provincial systems like healthcare or education, and then we've got programs that run out of our cities and our towns, so that they're often dealing with these multi-levels of government who, again, workers there may have different understandings of how this all fit together. So young people are really trying hard to navigate really complex things, often to get something really simple, like is there somewhere I can sleep, or can I go to school? One of the big things our clients tell us is their fear of exposure to immigration authorities. And that's the thing that governs a lot of their actions by day. I've had young people say to me, every time somebody suggested I go and do something after school, I think first, will this put me at risk of an immigration person understanding? So that might mean I'm not getting in the car with my friends because I'm worried if the cops pull me over, somehow people are going to find out about my immigration status. Or I'm not going to go and buy that thing from the mall because I've got no ID, so I'll never be able to return it, and someone will ask me why. Or I'm not going to sign up for that field trip at school because they're going to ask me about OHIP, and I'm going to have to explain why I don't have an OHIP card, and I don't know what those people will do with that information. So some of that is real risk. There is real risk for young people, I think, in the information being shared, because they don't know what any other people are going to do. And there's also perceived risk in the sense of I perceive there's a challenge here, so I'm just not even going to ask. So we see a lot of that, and we see this lack of knowledge and agency. Often our clients have absolutely no ID. Sometimes that's because no ID existed. Sometimes that's because adults or caregivers in their life have retained or destroyed that documentation, and they have no way of replacing it. And all of you know, if you've got one piece of ID, you can get the next piece of ID, but without anything, it can be really hard to do anything. So no ID. Often our clients have no bank accounts. They're using friends' bank accounts, or they're storing money under their mattresses. And the big one is often no information about their immigration history. So, and that's a really challenging place to start from, because it can feel really overwhelming. How on earth can I find out? And then I can make decisions. So this slide sort of, and there's more than this obviously, but here's the sort of the regular barriers our young clients experience. Firstly, education, so accessing kindergarten to high school and then post-secondary. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more in the first scenario. Healthcare, very often our clients who are out of status are not eligible for OHIP or health insurance. We have many clients who've never seen a doctor. They've chosen not to play any team sports or anything at school because they're worried about getting injured. So they're not doing any extracurriculars. And again, sometimes they're worried about the cost of going to a hospital if they're going to get billed privately. Sometimes they're worried that the hospital will share their information with immigration. So there's sort of multiple levels why folk aren't getting healthcare. Protection and safety, we find young people saying, this thing happened to me, but I'd never go to the police because I'm worried that the police will share my information. Same with children's aid societies. So that ability to creates a real risk for young people to be exploited. And that could include by employers or romantic partners or friends or pretty much landlords, anyone, if they understand that there's this immigration precarity, has that silenced this young person from complaining. Employment, working without legal authority is a reality for many young people or people in this circumstances. But it certainly means that things that other students or young people are taking for granted, such as guidance counsellors talking about summer jobs and all these kinds of things, that they're excluded from all of those formal systems. And again, often have to find a reason or a way of explaining why I'm not involved or why I'm not signing up for that thing. Financial security status is going to impact eligibility for financial support such as OW or ODSP, OSAP, or bursaries and scholarships. In housing, immigration precarity can have lots of different impacts on a young person's ability to get secure housing, including I've got no bank account, or I've got no credit history, or I've got no ID to sign a lease, or I'm not eligible for certain housing programs because of my immigration status. And often, real challenges with income security, so inability to reliably be able to pay rent, etc. So that was a lot. What we're going to do now is run through a couple of scenarios where we've got the first one on the screen, and then we're going to talk about the different issues that this young person is asked.
And sorry, just to be clear, the scenarios that we're going to talk through are different than what's on the activity sheet. So you're welcome to look at the activity sheet, but you don't need to pull it out specifically. This information is different than what's on there.
So, Esther, this first scenario, a 16-year-old seeks your help to get her belongings back from her mother after she had to leave home. So she's come with a completely non-immigration question. She arrived in Canada as a 3-year-old. She's been living with her non-biological mum ever since. She doesn't know if she was formally adopted or if she has immigration status. And she's coming to get her stuff back, but also because she's now living with a friend, she needs to change school boards. So she wants to change school boards, and she also wants to see a doctor. She's never seen a doctor before. So her 4 questions: can I register to attend high school? Can I get some OHIP? Can Children's Aid Society maybe help? And how can I get status? Which, are 4 lines when I put them on the piece of paper, but massive questions about pretty much every aspect of her safety and ability to do stuff. Esther, accessing education.
So accessing education in Canada, or in Ontario, I should say, you'll see the first line is that school access is a legal issue. And we really want, we put this here first because we really want to emphasize that there are legal aspects to this. And unfortunately, we see many people at CASA where kids have been denied access to school and no one has advised the student or their family to try and get legal advice. We recently spoke to somebody who's been trying to register her very young child for elementary school for over a year. And she was told various things which weren't accurate, and she just waited, unfortunately. And nobody gave her that information that this was a legal problem. I don't know, is it still on? That this was a legal problem and that and that there might be a legal solution. As Sarah said earlier, typically when we're, in terms of immigration law and immigration advice, we typically are advising and representing young people on their own. In the case of school access, we also advise and act for families and parents because of the fact that sometimes we're talking about not just youth, but very young children who can't advance their legal rights without adult support. So you'll see there are 2 pieces of legislation mentioned on the slide, and that's because access to education involves the interaction between federal law, the federal immigration law, and the Education Act, which is a piece of provincial legislation that governs who is entitled to attend Ontario public schools and high schools and who is fee exempt. So access to education involves the interaction between these 2 pieces of law. And then on top of that, there are memos and policies from both the provincial level, the Ministry of Education, and from various school boards. And it can get very complicated. And some of those memos and policies seem sometimes to conflict. Sometimes they seem to conflict with what's written in the Act, the Education Act, which is the law. And so it can get very complicated. In principle, everyone is entitled to go to school in Ontario regardless of status, but the Education Act also delineates which categories of people are fee exempt and which people have to pay fees. And when we talk about fees for public school in Ontario, we're talking about somewhere in the range of $15,000 to $17,000 a year. So it's obviously a very, very significant sum of money. And in practice, what we see is that most of the time, people who are told, families or parents or young people who are told, okay, you can enroll, you can register in school, but you have to pay these fees because we don't think you fall into one of the fee exempt categories. Usually they just typically don't enroll because very few people have access to those kinds of funds to pay for public school. You'll see at the bottom, and this is sort of where we're talking about practical as opposed to strictly maybe legal advice. Students don't need to wait for the start of the school year or the start of a semester to register. And in fact, I don't know about if you're joining us from outside of Toronto. I don't have a lot of experience with other school boards, but in Toronto, students are often told if they're arriving from a different country, they need to do an English or sometimes a math assessment. They don't need to wait for that assessment to be given a timetable and attend school. And sometimes we see different information or different advice from school boards or from schools themselves, from guidance counselors. And so I'm happy to share more information about what you can point to if you're doing this in practice, what you can point those school officials to say like, no, the student can be registered now, even though it's the middle of the semester, or they can start school today, even though, they're signed up for an assessment in a week or two. These are some excerpts from, I'm not going to read the full text. These are some excerpts from the Education Act, the piece of provincial legislation. The first bullet point is section 49.1, which is the section of the Act that allows people under 18 who have no status in Canada to go to school, and basically says that they shouldn't be excluded from school because they have no status or because their parents have no status. The next two bullet points are about fees, and this is where we get into these questions of people who are, where a school or school board may say, sure, you can enroll, we'll take you, but only if you pay these very, very high fees. And the people who the Act specifically talks about as requiring to pay fees are people who are here as, in red, you'll see temporary resident. So those are people who have visitor status, or people who have a study permit. So there are students who come to school boards in Ontario and across the country with study permits and pay those fees. And so in Ontario, this is designed to say, like, if you have one of these permits to attend secondary or elementary school here, you're going to pay the fees. And then the third bullet point talks about the groups that are exempted or accepted from paying the fees. And it's based on either the student or their parents' status, or somebody with custody of the child here. So things like if they're here on a temporary resident permit, a work permit, a study permit at a publicly funded institution, if they're a permanent resident, if they've made a refugee claim, or if they've made an application to become a permanent resident. But Sarah's going to touch on this later. Even those categories, we're seeing school boards trying to exclude and working to kind of narrow the groups of people who are able to access free public education in Ontario. And then, as I said, there's the law, and then there are various ministry policies, school board policies, memorandums. It can get very complicated. I speak personally as somebody who is learning about all of this and working in it now. This memo and when you're going to get a copy of these slides. This is hyperlinked, so you can go see the memo if you want. This is supposed to assist, this is from the ministry, and it's supposed to assist school boards in applying section 49.1, which is the section you saw before about students who are here in Canada without status or parents without status. And this says that the admissions criteria applied to those students should be no different from the criteria applied to any other child seeking admission. But then sort of confusingly, it talks about that the board may make inquiries to determine whether a child is entitled to be admitted to school with or without the payment of a fee, and may require proof of entitlement, provided that the standard of proof is no higher than that applied to other children. And so this is in here to sort of, hopefully it's useful. It's also kind of to show like, well, what does that mean if the admission criteria aren't different, but they're allowed to ask for these documents? What is the standard of proof that's being applied to these children, to other children? And again, I'm sure everyone will be sick of hearing this from us at the end, but these are often legal issues, legal questions, and there are organizations like ours, like Justice for Children and Youth, that can provide legal advice and assistance when people are being excluded from school or told to pay fees, which is often effectively excluding them from school.
Thanks, Esther. It sounds kind of simple. There's a piece of legislation that says everybody can go to school. There's some fee exemptions. So the system kind of feels like it should work. But we see it time and time again not working. And we see time and time again issues that we think we've resolved at one school board, then happening at another school board, or just different issues emerging, all within the lens of, I think, school boards really struggling to understand who they owe education to. And I do have some empathy for school boards. I think they are vastly underfunded. I think it's that they have been forced to rely on international student fees for so long. We've got, I think, now 5 school boards under supervision orders in Ontario. It's, I'm happy I'm not working in the education system. But that doesn't mean to say that these young people are the people who should bear the brunt of exclusion. And I think it can be, as we started saying, immigration staff can be really complex. So those front desk people at schools are trying to understand the complexities of an immigration system in a way that may take some time. So, I have some empathy, but our position is we would rather that schools were enrolling and including students, rather than taking an exclusionary lens as the starting point. And we've seen all sorts of annoying things coming up over time. Things like school boards choosing to misunderstand what an ETA or a multiple entry visa is, as in, to Esther's point, it doesn't give people status. It may last for 10 years. It doesn't mean that someone has valid status. They are fee exempt. We have school boards asking for documents that perhaps used to be part of a refugee claim or an immigration process that no longer exists, so no one can actually provide them. And we see school boards taking the most restrictive view of policies or legislation, really just to make it harder for young people or their families to register them. We've seen some recent emerging issues around school boards taking a restrictive approach to people who are 18 or who are turning 18. So that's been a really interesting one for us. And we're increasingly seeing school boards who are taking a restrictive approach around pieces around a young person's guardianship, or who is their guardian and where does that guardian reside. So this is an ever-changing sort of piece of the law, or piece of reality for young people. I agree with Esther. If people are having the struggle, it may be really worth their time to come and talk to a lawyer and to figure out what their options are. I think we generally get young people into school. Sometimes it's a bit of a bun fight, but we get them in. I think some strategies that I think of that are often helpful for families is often the conversations they're having with school boards are just conversations. So there's no record or trail of what's being said. So often I suggest people put that in an email. You told me this today. You told me I'm not fee exempt because of these reasons. So then at least the school board has to respond and say, yes, that's correct. So there's some kind of written record if possible. And another piece is school boards, they don't provide interpretation services. So if at all possible, they can go with a support person who can do the interpretation, who can take the notes. That's also helpful in terms of being able to talk to someone later and saying, this is what they said, and I did understand what they said. They can't just say, I didn't understand. Our school boards are such positions of authority. They're pieces of our government. So I think it can be really hard for people to understand that they might be getting wrong or intentionally wrong information from a school board. So, and I think that can be, from a migrant point of view, it's like, goodness me, this country that I thought was going to treat me kindly, how on earth can they be lying to me or putting this wrong? So I think that can be a really hard moment for families. But we've certainly seen young people out of school for years and years and years. We've got a client at the moment who's now 17. She's been out of school since grade 4. She was probably entitled to go to school fee exempt, but she was not told that by the school board. And she was also worried, or her family were worried, that the school board would share information. So it's resulted in a really different life for that young person. And this has such ripple effects, right? Getting a young person into school is so important for that young person, but it's also so important for their family. My kid's in school, I can go to work, I can do things. So it has this huge ripple impact, not just for kids, but for their families as well. So yes, we would love for them to get legal advice if that's what's happening. The second question the young person were asked was, I want to see a doctor, and we've touched on this a little, so I'll go through it really quickly. Status is going to impact people's eligibility for provincial healthcare. If status changes for people, that may change their eligibility. So keeping an eye on that. If an application's filed, or if you've got to a different stage of an application, your eligibility for OHIP, for example, may change, or your eligibility for interim federal health may change. If I'm maybe getting some kinds of services from a CAS, maybe I get OHIP eligibility, even if I'm not meeting the eligibility by immigration status. And then there's always options for people at community health centres or through what used to be called Telehealth Ontario, whose name I've now forgotten, or through paid clinics. But they can be super expensive, and CHCs often are able to provide primary care, but more involved or specialist care can be really challenging and really expensive. Sometimes we've had some luck arguing with hospitals when they have billed clients. Not always, but sometimes we can ask billing departments to take a humanitarian look at fees and to wipe fees for young people. But I think the biggest problem I see is people just not accessing healthcare, like being too scared to go, which can have such huge impacts on someone's health and well-being over time. Leaving home. So young people who need to or have to or must leave home for whatever reason. I know Emily from JFCY is going to talk a little bit more about the law from here, but what I would like from the immigration point of view to say is that young people without status or precarious status are still entitled to services from children's aid societies. That shouldn't impact their eligibility at all. And in fact, having no immigration status may be part of the piece when a CAS is looking at a young person being in need of care or protection. And there's sort of, if a young person is looking for services from a children's aid society, there's processes and systems in place that are designed to protect those young persons' rights and give them information. And one piece that is interesting, and it's temporary, is almost 2 years ago, the government brought in a specific pathway to permanent residence for young people who had been in the formal care of a children's aid society. It's a temporary pathway. It's supposed to expire next January if it's not extended. But what that would mean is a young person, if they have been in the formal care of a children's aid society, and there's multiple in Ontario and multiple across Canada, that they may have a much simpler pathway to permanent residence based purely on the fact that the government really was their caregiver. It's a fee-free pathway. It's supposed to be faster. I would love for it to be permanent, but we haven't heard anything. But it's a good one to know. And it's a good one to know because that's not just for children, that's for adults who were previously in care. So if you're working with adults, that might be a really interesting one to inquire about. Did you ever have any involvement with children's aid? Were you in the children's aid formal custody? So that might be a good one to know. Esther, this is you.
So obviously, status regularization is a big part of the work that we do, and we are often representing and assisting, providing advice and assisting young people who have to apply for status independently as the principal applicant. As I already said, from a legal perspective, I think it's really important that people get advice even before they decide what type of application is right for them. I know that can be difficult to access, especially for somebody who doesn't have the funds to pay to hire a lawyer, to pay for a consultation. It can be very difficult to access legal advice about what options are available, what route should they take, what are the pros and cons. So that's something that we're able to do for the clients that we serve, is to try and spend a bit of time talking through with them, answering questions, going over things multiple times. We often see our clients are often making humanitarian and compassionate applications. There's a lot to say about those, which is sort of out of the scope of this presentation. But one important point is that it can be very beneficial to somebody to submit that type of application before they turn 18. And that they can do that and they can submit an application on their own as the principal applicant, even if they haven't turned 18 yet. The immigration department sometimes takes a different view, but that's something that that young people can do. And that's part of what Sarah talked about, our position and our view that young people are individual rights holders and children are rights holders. That they aren't just submitting these applications as dependents, and that somebody, a 16 or 17-year-old with the capacity to make that decision for themselves should be allowed to submit that application. And then we also sometimes see people choosing to make a refugee claim. There are different protections at the refugee board. So, for example, the designated representative scheme, which is only at the Immigration and Refugee Board right now, provides it's a different sort of process than if you're making an immigration application directly to the immigration department. And for all of our clients, whether they're minors or whether they're over 18, a lot of these processes can be very overwhelming. They may need support navigating the process, understanding legal terms, communicating effectively with a lawyer, collecting information and documents for their applications. And so one of the services that we provide is that navigation support as well. And the last point about fees, just to acknowledge and to sort of share the information that, fees for many people, the fees for making a humanitarian application can be quite prohibitive. If young people are making the application as a principal applicant, they have to pay the principal applicant fee, even if they're under 18. So that's $635 plus $85 if they have to do biometrics. And those are not fees that are covered by a legal aid certificate. So legal aid certificates pay for what we call disbursements, but they don't cover application fees. And so it's important to acknowledge that I think when we're working with young people as well, to make sure that they don't, get their hopes up or go down this path of preparing something and then discover at the end that actually the application fee is going to be a massive barrier for them.
Yeah, the fees are awful. They're so huge. So, if there's possibilities in your agencies of finding ways of funding fees, that is obviously fantastic. We work as hard as we can to be able to do that for our clients, but they are enormous. They're enormous for everybody. They're particularly enormous for someone who's 17 and at high school and has no job. I would love to see some kind of PR pathway for young people where there were no fees. That would make sense to me. But yeah, this status piece, I think, echoing Esther's comments, getting advice early so a lawyer can sort of investigate all the possible options, because there may be some that the young person hasn't thought about, that you haven't thought about, that may provide a simpler, more secure or faster route forward. So we would always encourage really early legal advice on that front. Scenario 2, okay, thank you. I think what we're going to do with scenario 2, given we're a wee bit short of time, is we're going to just talk about it and then we're going to whip through some of the legal contents because we've got some pieces in our slides. Scenario 2, I think you were going to read.
So an 18-year-old arrived in Canada as an 8-year-old and comes to you, Sarah, seeking advice.
Okay.
They're without status and they're working under the table at a restaurant. They attended school until grade 8 and their boss at the restaurant is withholding their wages. They want to know, can I work without status? Can I fight to get my unpaid wages back? Could I get any kind of financial support or social assistance? Can I go to college or university? And how can I get some ID?
Just regular teenage questions. So we're going to whip through some of these, and maybe I'll just whip through by saying, with the employment law piece, yes, people are supposed to have legal authority to work. Lots of people work without it. And that may have implications for their current immigration applications or future ones. So understanding how that fits together is important. And we would be, and their lawyers, if they're working with a lawyer, is going to want to know that. And that's part of their job, right? Lawyers, part of their job is to explain the hard things to immigration. And some of it is to explain the good things to immigration. But they're going to need to disclose that information. And yes, regardless of your status, you're protected by employment law. So you should be able to seek redress for those wages, although we recognise that happens within a cone of precarity and possibility for exploitation. But the law says, yes, you should be paid.
And I'll just add that this is an area I think where community organizing can have a really important and significant impact. I don't know if other people are aware of groups like the Najawan Support Network. They were doing a lot of important work to fight for unpaid wages for people with precarious status, because that kind of, it can be very, very difficult and daunting and scary for somebody to fight for something like that on their own. And if they're part of a larger group or supported by an organization, we can sometimes see a lot more success in those cases.
The next 2 slides are about Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Program, both financial supports. I think the thing where it intersects with immigration is status will impact eligibility, but people may be eligible or they may become eligible at different stages through their immigration or their refugee claim. So it's important to note that a no might not be a no. It may be a no for now, but it may change. And sometimes people get negative decisions when they apply for OW or ODSP that can be challenged. So it might be a really helpful time to get some legal advice around, was this decision right? Can I still get my money? Moving on to post-secondary. What a great question this person asked. Can I go to post-secondary? And I'm really pleased that the BATE project is here to talk more detail about post-secondary this afternoon. But in a nutshell, as we all know, everything changes once someone finishes high school. It changes for people who are born here. It changes for people who weren't born here. Most people have to pay fees to go to university or college. For people without status or precarious status, it's going to be even more complex. People generally probably, their status is going to impact probably all of their post-secondary plans. And again, it can be nuanced. Again, it can change depending on what's happening with their immigration pieces. But some big things to sort of understand is for most post-secondary institutions, people are going to need study permits that are specific to that program and that institution. So if they're on a study permit that lets them go to high school, that's not going to cut it. They're going to need a new one. And that's going to bring requirements for showing up front the amount of money they have to pay fees and all sorts of things. So they're really challenging, and people might not be eligible for them if they're out of status. Probably not. That they're probably not going to be eligible for OSAP or sort of bursaries that other students take as required. And sometimes our school systems, our post-secondary systems, even if they're sort of in the door, there's going to be things that come up that intersect with status. For example, post-secondary institutions asking about SIN numbers. They might not be asking for status reasons, but it's totally impacting someone's and connected to someone's immigration status. So sometimes those institutions just ask things in a way that throws a light on status unintentionally. There are some sanctuary scholars programs that exist in Toronto and Ontario that is the BRAIT program we're going to talk about this afternoon. They're really interesting, and they are a really innovative way of trying to get people access and enable them to keep moving their life forward. And some of our institutions also have academic bridging programs that people without status may be able to access. So a good example would be the Spanning the Gaps program here at TMU, where some people without status I know have gone and flourished. And those programs often are designed to get people over the gap. So this young person has been out of school for a long time. Perhaps spanning the gap is going to be the thing that gets them into the position where they get their credits and they can actually get into university moving forward.
I think we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but just to acknowledge that getting identification can be both crucial and also extremely challenging. There's a point here about the fact that people can get certain types of ID in Ontario by presenting a valid a non-Canadian passport, which may be a useful or sort of attractive option for some people, but also from an immigration perspective to know that if people don't have a valid passport from their home country, there can be risks to applying to get a new one, depending on the person's immigration status or what immigration applications they're in the process of making or contemplating making. So it's really helpful if you're working with people, like if your organization has an ID clinic, or if you're helping a young person try and figure out what kind of ID could they get. It can be very important to know what their immigration status is before you help them, for example, or advise them to get a new passport so that they can get an Ontario ID. And it's also maybe useful to know that there can be legal sort of workarounds in some cases. Lawyers can commission affidavits, for example, where someone can swear about their identity or about their address. And those may be useful when the person can't get any document or can't use any, doesn't have access to a document that's required, for example, to get a certain kind of ID.
Yeah, I think one of my tips is as soon as we talk to a young person, I'm always like, what kind of ID have you got? Can we get you an ID card right now from the Ontario government because you've got a passport? Let's do that right now. Having a piece of Ontario-issued ID changes everything. And with different kinds of immigration applications or a refugee claim, that passport is probably going to go. It'll be taken. So we have this moment. And Esther makes a good point. Having a passport means you're travel ready. It's easier for immigration or CBSA to take steps to remove you. So sort of understanding if I get this passport because I'm trying to help this young person get a bank account, it may have all these other things that are kicking around.
So for us, the bottom line in terms of trying to help people understand what are legal issues and identify legal issues, some of them are really obvious. If somebody comes to you and says, I have no immigration status, hopefully that's a kind of a bell goes off like, oh, your immigration status, that's a legal issue. But others can be more hidden, or the usefulness of sort of legal support or advice can be less obvious. Really, people's eligibility or denial of access to any government service, or their ability or access to even making an application for a government service, and that would include services provided directly by the government, and also things like school boards. Really, any of those things can really have a legal component. And you'll see 3 examples that we've put up here. So someone who is a permanent resident but doesn't have any ID to show it, and therefore is being told they can't get an OHIP card. Like if they're a permanent resident, they are entitled to OHIP, but they're being told, oh, you don't have these documents at Service Ontario, so you can't get your card. Or a 17-year-old told that they can't submit an immigration application on their own. And that could be that they're being told by immigration directly, or they're getting, the wrong advice from somebody in their community, or even from a lawyer. And the last point here, from our perspective, from an immigration perspective, it's really important to understand that immigration applications for the same person or for their family members should really be considered all sort of interconnected, because the immigration department can compare information from past applications, whether that's visitor visa applications, past permanent resident applications, sponsorships, previous humanitarian applications. They can all be accessed and compared. And so it's important to understand what information immigration already knows about a person or about their family before they figure out kind of what information to put on a new application.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good point. Often different kinds of immigration applications feel quite discrete. This is a work permit application, somebody's filling that in. But if there's also a permanent residence application, if those 2 things don't say the same thing, then immigration's going to want to know why. Why have you said you've got this many brothers here? Why have you said you've lived in these many places? So really trying to understand them as all connected. There's one file at immigration. All those applications go into that one pile for that person. So sort of our last slides now, in terms of any tips that we have for you who are, doing this work every day. We get that. But this piece around educating yourself and your organisation about how these issues impact young people particularly, and that might be really different from how they impact your adult clients. This big piece around issue spotting. If I see it's a legal issue, what do I do? If I think it's a legal issue and I'm not sure, what do I do? And our answer to that would be reach out to a local legal clinic or reach out to us or JFCY and say, is this a legal issue? Can someone get some help around it? Meeting young people where they're at. We've talked a little bit about how young people often have no immigration history. They don't know what their circumstances is. They're juggling grade 11 exams. They've got all sorts of stuff going on. So meeting them where they're at. And, they're the decision makers, right? They're the boss of what happens to them. So being able to provide services in a way that is patient and allows them to come and go. That's what we find works best with our clients. A rights-respecting approach. And here I think it's really important that young people know exactly what you're going to ask them in advance so they can make a decision about what to tell you. So being really clear about how you're going to hold their information, whether you feel like you need to share their information so that they can make all those choices without having to ask you. And I would suggest that they happen really clearly up front. This is what I'm asking. These are the 10 questions. This one's going to be about status. This one is not. And I'm going to hold your information, or I'm going to share it with people at my agency, but I'm not going to share it with your family. Like whatever that rule is, that they can make the decision up front rather than getting told at the end, oh, I'm going to tell your family. This truth in advertising piece, I think this is about eligibility criteria on your websites. Make sure that young people know if they're out of status or they've got some kind of status, are they entitled to your services? So make sure that that's really clear for them and it's in language that they understand. the understanding this real versus perceived barriers. So we can talk about actually what the issue is, but if young people think it's different, it's probably going to have the same effect. So sort of understanding those two pieces. A big one here of helping young people understand what other service providers do. And I think lawyers are a really good example. I think most people are terrified of lawyers. Most people think lawyers are expensive. People don't always understand that lawyers have to hold information confidentially. So helping a young person understand what it would mean to talk to a lawyer and how a lawyer isn't just going to do something. They're going to have to get instructions from the young person. That might really increase their comfort or ability to say, okay, I'll talk to somebody. So sort of helping young people understand what people do and the bounds in which they do it. And then this piece around appropriate, warm, successful referrals. Sometimes it takes multiple referrals to get it to stick, particularly for young people. So we'll often do really warm referrals where we'll contact the agency. We're going to send this young person. Can we come to the first meeting? Can we really make sure that has worked? Rather than giving young people a list and saying, make a call. And I know that time is tight and all of you have got so many calls on your time, but making a referral work and letting a young person know if this doesn't work, you can come back, we'll try again. If it doesn't feel right, if that person didn't feel good, come back, we'll try again. And then this other piece around if young people aren't eligible for your services, is it possible for you to figure out who would be a good fit for them and doing that warm referral? Yeah, that's pretty much where we're at. I wanted to show you a slide, the next slide, about where to get legal assistance, because we keep saying get legal advice and it feels annoying to even say it to you, I'm sorry. But there are often, for young people in particular, really good options for getting free legal advice, such as Ontario's system of community legal clinics. I think there's 73 of them across the province. They're all attached to a neighbourhood. So if you put someone's postal code in, it'll tell you which legal clinic is theirs. Not all legal clinics do all kinds of law, but if you call a legal clinic and say this is the issue, and they say we can't help, the next question is, cool, who can? Tell me who to go to next. And they generally have really good referrals, so I would always be recommending them. Some legal clinics are specialty legal clinics, so they provide services to a particular identity of people or ethno-cultural sort of group, or, for example, age, with Justice for Children and Youth, only providing services to young people. So it might be the neighbourhood one, but it might be a specialty legal clinic. And then there's centres like ours, the OCASI program, who don't fit within that legal clinic system, but are also offering legal services there. Pro bono law, Ontario is often a really good fit, maybe not so much on the immigration, but a lot of these ancillary pieces around the employment stuff or the housing stuff or those kinds of things. It's free, it's a phone call. And another really helpful resource is Steps to Justice, which is a resource of CLEO, Community Legal Education Ontario. It's an online resource, and they have them on a ton of legal topics. There's some really good ones around immigration, and even on other legal topics. They may talk about if you are eligible for if you're eligible based on your immigration status. And they have some guided pathways, which means actually telling people how to prepare applications or submit applications. So they are a really good and reliable, trustworthy resource for you as well. I think we're there. This is us. The last slide is, this is how to get hold of us should you want to hear our voices anymore. I feel like you've heard a lot from us today. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions for us.
The first question is, how does CASA assist youths that are in rural areas who rely on their family members to access your services, especially since CASA does not assist the family in general? Are there organizations or rural position representing CASA to assist youth in rural areas?
What a great question. This is so hard, right? You're thinking of a young person who wants independent legal advice and maybe your family are supporting or not supporting. We get a ton of our referrals from schools and guidance counsellors or social workers or people working in agencies that young people may be attached to. So often it's that person who's helped them connect with us. So we often rely on that person to help us create safe meeting spaces for young people, or having computers so we can log on and meet. Sometimes, depending on the circumstances, we'll come and we'll try to meet in person if that's what makes sense. But you've identified a really big access to justice problem, making sure, and we have lots of clients who they can't talk to us when they're at home. So they're trying to find, we have a client at the moment who talks to us only in the basement of his apartment building. He's talking really quietly all the time. So trying to find systems of support that are outside the family that would help us would probably be the first one we do, or coming to meet in person.
And we do provide a lot of our services virtually. So for people who are able to connect with us by email or by phone, we can provide legal services and support to people across the province. We try and meet, as Sarah said in an earlier slide, we do try and meet people where they're at. And so sometimes that means, driving to meet people in person, and sometimes it means meeting with somebody who's in a far part of the province virtually, and relying again on partners, or there are community legal clinics across the province. So working with them, even if they're not going to provide representation to that person, can they provide meeting space? Can they provide Wi-Fi access? That kind of thing.
Any participant have question? Yes, please use the mic.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for all the hard work that you do. I think it's absolutely incredible that organizations like this exist, and we definitely need more of them. My question comes very similar to providing access to folks who live in rural parts of the province. How do you provide that level of support for individuals and families who language is a major barrier for them? And how do you provide that comfort and reassurance that that interpretation service then is not going to kind of like expose their precarious immigration status?
Oh, another really good question. Most of the young people we work with, many of whom have been here a long time, are in our school systems and are operating in English or French, even if their families aren't. So that is helpful for us. We use translation and interpretation services. We have access to pretty much any language that somebody wants, and we're using professional translators and that are bound by confidentiality, etc. But, people live within communities where information can get out in different ways. And I agree that feels really risky for a young person to be doing that. But that's the sort of steps we take, that as much as possible, we'll be talking to them independently. If they want us to have anybody else in the room to translate for them, I think we would probably rather have a translator that we've booked so we can control that, rather than them having a friend or a family member. But it's going to be their choice in that sense.
Thank you. Then we will. Oh, sorry. You want to?
I was just going to add. Going back to the earlier slide, in terms of a rights respecting approach, I think we do a lot of work to try and communicate with people when when we're first meeting them, what the confidentiality rules that we follow are, if they have other people with them, for example, a family member or a support person, or if it's another professional especially, we ask that person to explain what their confidentiality sort of boundaries are. And with interpreters, we will sort of explain to our clients, like, the interpreter is also bound by confidentiality, get them to confirm that with the young person. But yeah, it is a challenge I've definitely encountered people in the past who are concerned about interpreters from their own community. We're having those conversations with people as well to try and understand if they do have concerns, can they be sort of mitigated? Can we, if it's about using a different interpreter, if it's using an interpreter of a particular gender or something like that.
Thank you. We are almost on time for break. So I think we have a few more questions. The in-person participant, the speakers are here. You can approach them throughout the day get a response to your answers, but online participant, I promise I will find a way to reply to your questions in live or get back to you later. And with that, I would like to thank Sarah and Esther for setting a strong foundation by outlining both the legal realities and the human impact on status precarity. Thank you.